The knock and rattle of the old Ford F-100 was a sound as familiar to Arthur Miller as his own heartbeat. The faded red paint, worn down to a chalky pink in some places and primer grey in others, had soaked up 21 years of Iowa sun. The driver's side door let out a groan of protest as he pushed it open, the sound of tired metal that had earned its rest a decade ago. He stepped out onto the pristine, black-topped lot of Blevin's Agon implement, and the truck let out one last, loud backfire, a defiant cough of blue smoke that seemed to hang in the humid July air. Heads turned. Two young men in crisp new dealership polo shirts stopped their conversation by a row of lawn tractors and stared. From inside the massive plate glass front of the new building, Art could see the silhouette of Frank Blevins himself, pausing with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Frank had built this new place last year, a palace of steel and glass that looked more like a city airport than a tractor dealership. It was a long way from the greasy, dirt-floored Quonset hut where his father had sold used farmals after the war. A young salesman, his hair slicked back and his smile a little too wide, detached himself from the building and swaggered toward Art. His name tag read, Ricky. "Help you with something, old-timer?" Ricky asked, his eyes flicking from Art's worn denim overalls to the rust patch on the Ford's fender, a grin playing on his lips. "Looking for the parts department? It's around back, though I doubt we've got anything for a relic like that." Art ignored the jab. His eyes were scanning the front line, the heavy iron, the big boys. A brand new John Deere 46640 sat gleaming under the sun, its green paint so deep you could fall into it. Next to it, a massive, blocky Case 2470 Agri King, its duals looking wide enough to pave a highway, and at the end of the row, the crown jewel, a Gleaner L2 combined with a corn head that looked bigger than Art's whole barn. The silver paint of the Gleaner was almost blinding. "Just looking," Art said, his voice a low rumble. He started walking the line, his calloused hand running lightly over the giant rear tire of the Deere. He could feel the quality of the rubber, the depth of the tread. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing, the way a man assesses livestock, judging the health and strength of the beast. He could hear Ricky chuckling to his buddies as he walked away. "Can you believe that? Guy pulls up in a rust bucket held together with baling wire, and he's window shopping for a $100,000 tractor." Another man came out of the showroom, clapping Ricky on the shoulder. Dale Peterson. Dale farmed the section next to Art's place to the north. He was 30 years younger, always in a hurry, and always driving the newest machine Frank Blevins could sell him. He'd just traded in a 2-year-old International 1086 for a new 1486. Dale was Frank's poster boy for modern farming, leveraged to the hilt, farming 1,000 acres he didn't quite own, and convinced that any machine older than the current president was scrap metal. "What's he want, Rick?" Dale asked, loud enough for Art to hear. "A new hubcap for that Ford." "Worse," Ricky snickered. "He's kicking the tires on the 4640. Dale let out a loud laugh. "Art? Hell, that old man still thinks a Farmel M is the peak of modern engineering. He probably doesn't even know how to turn the key on that thing. Be careful he doesn't have a heart attack just looking at the price tag." Art kept walking. He stopped at the case, peering at the engine through the side panels. A 504 cubic inch turbocharged diesel. He knew the specs. He'd read the magazines. He knew the fuel consumption rates, the horsepower at the PTO, the hydraulic flow in gallons per minute. He wasn't some fool wandering in off the street. He was a farmer, and this was the machinery of his trade. He knew it better than the slick-haired boy who sold it. He finished his inspection at the Gleaner. He ran his hand along the sheet metal, feeling for the gauge, the quality of the welds. He looked at the feeder house, the cylinder bars, the Walker assembly. It was a well-built machine. Simple for its size. Reliable. He turned and walked back toward the glass palace, his work boots making a soft, steady rhythm on the asphalt. He walked right past Ricky and Dale, who fell silent as he approached, their smirks frozen on their faces. He pushed open the heavy glass door, letting a gust of frigid, conditioned air wash over him, and walked to the front counter. "I need to see Frank," he said to the young woman at the reception desk. A moment later, he was being ushered into Frank Blevin's office. It was opulent, plush carpet, a mahogany desk the size of a pool table, and a picture on the wall of Frank shaking the governor's hand. "Art," Frank said, not getting up. He gestured to a leather chair. "What can I do for you? If it's about that old Model B of yours, I'm telling you the parts are getting impossible to find. Maybe it's time you thought about an upgrade. I could put you in a nice little 2040, something your size." Art didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the expensive carpet, his old seed corn cap in his hands. "I'm not here about the B, Frank. No? What's on your mind, then?" Frank said, leaning back in his chair, a picture of smug success. "That 4640 out front," Art began, his voice even. "The case 2470, and the Gleaner L2 with the 8-row corn head." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? They're fine machines, Art. The best. What about them?" "I'll take them," Art said. The silence in the office was absolute. Frank's patronizing smile slowly dissolved. He stared at Art, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. He saw the clear, steady eyes, the set of his jaw. There was no joke there. Then, the dam broke. Frank let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Ricky, who had been shamelessly eavesdropping at the door, pushed it open and joined in, his laughter high and mocking. "You'll take them?" Frank chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. "Art, that's over $200,000 of equipment out there. We're not running a charity. You'd never get a loan for that in a million years. The bank would laugh you right out of the building." Art just stood there and let them laugh. He waited until their chuckles died down into wheezing gasps. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He just waited, his patience a stone wall against which their mockery broke and fell away. Before we see the look on Frank Blevin's face when he finally understands, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Judged and underestimated by people who thought they knew better, only for you to have the last laugh? Drop a comment below and tell me your story. It's a feeling of satisfaction that money just can't buy. When the room was quiet again, Art reached down and picked up the weathered leather satchel he'd set by his feet. It was an old doctor's bag his father had used for decades. He placed it on the corner of Frank's gleaming mahogany desk with a heavy thud. He undid the 2 brass clasps. He didn't say a word. He just opened the bag. Inside, nestled in neat rows, were stacks of $100 bills, wrapped in paper bands from the First National Bank of Cedar County. Beside them were 3 cashier's checks, their light blue paper a stark contrast to the worn leather. The top one was made out to Blevin's Ag and Implement. Frank Blevins leaned forward, his eyes wide. He picked up one of the checks, his hand trembling slightly. Ricky's jaw was hanging open, his face pale. The laughter was gone. The air in the office was thick with the smell of new money and old pride. "Now," Art said, his voice as calm and steady as ever, "let's talk about a cash discount." The deal was done in a state of stunned silence. Art, it turned out, was a far tougher negotiator than Frank had ever imagined. He knew the dealer invoice price on every machine, knew the holdbacks, knew the margin Frank was playing with. He argued over the cost of the freight and dealer prep, things most farmers just accepted. He wasn't emotional, he was clinical. He was buying tools, not status symbols. Frank Blevins, who was used to farmers begging him for financing terms, found himself on the back foot. The cash on the table was a powerful lure, but with no financing, there were no kickbacks from the bank, no hidden profits. Art was stripping the deal down to the bare metal. By the time they shook hands, Frank's palm was sweaty. Art's was dry and firm. The news hit the coffee shop in town before Art's Ford had even cooled in his own driveway. Old man Miller lost his mind. That was the consensus. Paid cash, someone whispered in awe. Must have been his wife's inheritance, another speculated. He's been sitting on that since Mary passed. Dale Peterson was the most vocal. He held court at the corner table at the diner, a half-eaten piece of pie forgotten in front of him. "It's suicide," he declared to anyone who would listen. "Pure insanity. What's an old man like that need with a 46 or 40? He farms 320 acres. My 1486 could plough his whole place in a day and a half. He doesn't have the acreage to support that kind of iron." "He paid cash, Dale," Old man Hemmings from the co-op pointed out. "No payments." "That's not the point," Dale shot back, slapping the table. "It's the principle. That money should be working for him. He could have bought my old 1066 for a quarter of the price, put the rest of that cash into buying the Henderson place, and doubled his operation. That's how you get ahead. He's just going to let that machinery sit and rust. He doesn't understand leverage. He doesn't understand modern farming." The scorn was a tangible thing. It followed Art to the co-op, to the feed store. Men who had known him his whole life now looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He had broken the unwritten rule. In the 1970s, you didn't hoard cash, you used the bank's money. You expanded. You got big. Art had done the opposite. He had consolidated. He had traded paper for iron. To them, it looked like the confused act of a man entering his dotage. The following Monday, a lowboy truck rumbled down Art's gravel lane, carrying the John Deere. Another followed with the case. The gleaner would come later. Art was waiting. He directed the drivers with simple hand signals, having them place the machines on the high ground near his machine shed. After the trucks left, the farm was quiet. The new machine sat there, silent and immense, dwarfing his old Farmall M and the two-row corn picker that suddenly looked like toys. Art spent the rest of the day just walking around them, touching them, familiarizing himself with them. The smell was intoxicating, a mixture of fresh paint, diesel fuel, and the faint, oily scent of cosmoline coating the unpainted metal parts. He didn't fire them up. Not yet. For the next 2 weeks, Art Miller became a student. The operator's manuals were thick as city phone books. He sat at his kitchen table every night, a single lamp illuminating the pages, reading every word. He studied the hydraulic diagrams, the wiring schematics, the lubrication charts. He learned about the sound guard body on the Deere, the power shift transmission in the case, the transverse cylinder design of the gleaner. During the day, he was in the shed. He didn't trust the dealer prep. He started with the 4640. He pulled out his grease gun, a heavy lever-action model, and went over the machine from front to back. The manual showed 64 grease zerks. He found every one, from the front axle pivots to the 3-point hitch linkages, wiping each one clean before pumping in fresh grease until he saw the old stuff purge out. He checked the engine oil, the transmission fluid, the hydraulic level. He pulled the dipsticks, wiping them on a clean red rack, holding them to the light, smelling them. He opened the radiator, checking the coolant. He laid on his back on a creeper and slid underneath, checking for any loose bolts or leaking fittings from the factory. He did the same for the case, then spent a full day going over the gleaner, He crawled inside the guts of the combine, checking the tension on every belt and chain, running his fingers over the cylinder bars to check for imperfections. This wasn't the act of a man who had bought a toy. This was the act of a professional taking possession of his tools. He was learning their language, their needs. He knew that these machines, as complex as they were like any other tool. They would serve you well if you respected them, and they would fail you miserably if you didn't. His neighbor Dale would drive by slowly in his pickup, shaking his head at the sight of art, covered in grease, meticulously servicing brand new equipment. Dale's own new 1486 was already coated in a layer of dust and mud, having been put to work the day it was delivered. For Dale, time spent in the shed was time wasted. For Art, it was the most important investment he could make. Finally, the day came. He climbed up the steps into the cab of the 4640. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing him in a world of quiet. The cab was a revelation. It was clean, spacious, with a comfortable seat and a radio. Compared to the open station of his old Farmall, it was a palace. He turned the key. The 426 cubic inch diesel engine turned over and roared to life, settling into a smooth, powerful idle that he could feel more than hear through the insulated cab. He engaged the transmission, and the big green tractor moved forward, effortlessly. He felt a slow smile spread across his weathered face. It was a good machine. He didn't do it to show off. He didn't do it to get rich. He did it because he'd learned a hard lesson from his father, a lesson forged in the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. You cannot trust paper. You cannot trust promises. You can only trust the land under your feet and the iron in your shed. He'd watched inflation start to tick up in the late 60s. He saw the price of everything, from a loaf of bread to a new plowshare, creeping higher each year. His money in the bank, the money Mary had so carefully saved, was shrinking. It was losing its power. He knew his old equipment was on its last legs. A new engine overhaul for the Farmall would cost a fortune, and you still had an old tractor. He saw the future, a day when he would be forced to buy a new machine, not with cash, but with a loan. A loan at interest rates that were climbing higher every month. He would be trapped, just like everyone else. So he made a choice. He took all his paper, all his promises, and he traded it for steel. He bought the last set of farm equipment he would ever need. He wasn't leveraging himself for the future. He was insulating himself from it. He was buying his freedom. The next few years seemed to prove Dale Peterson right and Art Miller wrong. The mid-1970s were a boom time for American agriculture. The Russian grain deal opened up new markets, and commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans followed. Land values doubled, then tripled. The banks, flush with cash, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the government was simple: get big or get out. Dale Peterson got big. He bought the Henderson place when old man Henderson retired, adding another 240 acres. He leased another quarter section from a widow in town. He was farming nearly 1,500 acres now. His new 1486 wasn't big enough anymore. He traded it in on a brand new four-wheel drive Steiger Panther, an articulated monster that could pull a 30-foot chisel plow. The ground shook when it went down the road. Frank Blevins loved Dale. He was the perfect customer. Every 2 years, like clockwork, Dale would be back, trading in his perfectly good equipment for the newest, biggest, most powerful model. He was always chasing that extra 5% of efficiency, that extra 10 horsepower. He saw debt not as a burden, but as a tool, a resource to be used like fertilizer or seed. He'd sit in the diner, his checkbook out, showing the other farmers his cash flow charts. "You see," he'd explain, "the interest is tax deductible. And with land values going up 20% a year, I'm making money just by signing the loan papers. Old man Miller, he's missing the boat. He's sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig." The community saw Dale as a visionary, a captain of industry. They saw Art as a relic. He was still farming his same 320 acres. His new equipment made the work easy. He could plow his ground in a few days, plant in 2. Harvest was a leisurely week. His yields were excellent because his powerful new tractors allowed him to work the ground at the perfect time, not just when his old, underpowered equipment would allow. His new combine lost less grain out the back, putting more in the bin. He was making more money than he ever had in his life, but he didn't show it. He still drove the old Ford truck. He still wore his worn overalls. He didn't buy more land. He didn't lease any ground. With all his newfound free time, he did something that baffled his neighbors even more. He started improving the land he already owned. He hired a man with a tiling machine and systematically laid thousands of feet of drain tile in his low spots, turning soggy ground into his most productive soil. He took soil samples and worked with the university extension to create a precision fertilizer program, spoon-feeding the crop exactly what it needed instead of just dumping it on by the ton. He built new terraces to stop erosion on his rolling ground. To Dale and the coffee shop crowd, this was madness. "He's polishing the chrome while the parade goes by," Dale would say with a laugh, "spending good money on tile when he could be buying the Johnson farm. He's thinking small." Art paid them no mind. He was debt-free. Every bushel of corn he sold was his. He didn't have to sell at harvest when the price was low to make a payment. He could store his grain and wait, selling it when the market peaked in the spring. Dale, on the other hand, was a slave to his loan payments. The grain trucks ran straight from his fields to the elevator. He had to sell, regardless of the price. One afternoon in the fall of '78, Frank Blevins himself drove down Art's lane in his shiny new Lincoln. He found Art in the machine shed, wiping down the gleaner after the last day of harvest. The combine, 5 seasons old now, still shone like new. "Art, you keep this stuff looking better than the new ones on my lot," Frank said, trying to sound friendly. "A man takes care of his tools," Art replied, not stopping his work. "Listen, Art," Frank said, getting to the point. "That 4640 of yours has held its value like you wouldn't believe. I've got a brand new 4840 on the lot, more horsepower, better cab. I could give you a great trade-in value on yours, set you up with a nice loan package. The interest rates are still reasonable." Art finally stopped wiping and looked at Frank. "Why would I do that, Frank? My tractor is paid for. It does everything I need it to do. Why would I want a new payment?" "To upgrade, to stay modern," Frank said, exasperated. "It's about progress, Art." "Doesn't feel like progress to owe a man money," Art said quietly, and went back to his work. Frank left in a cloud of dust and frustration. That winter, the signs began to appear, small at first, like the first dark clouds on a distant horizon. A story on the evening news about the new Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, and his talk of fighting inflation. The manager at the co-op mentioned that the regional bank that financed their operating loans was asking for more paperwork this year, tightening the screws a little. The price of diesel fuel jumped 5 cents in a week, then 10. One evening, Art was in his quiet house, listening to the radio. The wind howled outside, a cold January wind that rattled the window panes. In the distance, through the wind, he could hear another sound. It was the deep, guttural roar of a big diesel engine. It was Dale Peterson's Steiger, running with the lights on, pulling a giant V-ripper through the frozen ground, trying to get a jump on spring fieldwork. Art walked to the window and looked out into the blackness, toward the sound. He saw the distant headlights crawling across the horizon. Dale was running hard, running fast, trying to outrun the numbers in his ledger. Art knew that sound wasn't the sound of progress anymore. It was the sound of desperation. It was the sound of a man on a treadmill whose speed was being set by men in suits 1,000 miles away. The boom was ending. The storm was coming. And Art Miller, standing in his warm, quiet, paid-for house, knew he was ready. The spring of 1980 arrived late and angry. A cold, wet April kept the planters in the shed, and when the weather finally broke, it was with a sudden, searing heat. The ground went from mud to concrete in a week. That was the first sign. Then came the news, filtering out of the radios in tractor cabs and kitchens. The president had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been projected at $3.50 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. Art heard the news and felt a cold knot in his stomach, but it was the familiar knot of caution, not the sharp panic he saw in the faces of his neighbors. He had his grain from the previous year stored safely in his bins. He could afford to wait. Dale Peterson could not. Art saw the lights on Dale's grain bins burning all night as the augers loaded truck after truck, hauling his entire 1979 crop to the elevator at a disastrous price. He had to generate cash flow. The bank's operating note was due. The heatwave of that summer was brutal. The sky turned a hazy, bleached white for weeks on end. Corn leaves curled up tight by midday, a defensive posture that farmers called pineappling. The rain simply stopped. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. Art's fields, with their new tile lines and terracing, held the moisture better than most. His crops suffered, but they would survive. He would have a crop to harvest. Dale's land was not so fortunate. He had pushed it too hard for too long. He'd ploughed out grass waterways and bulldozed terraces to create long, uninterrupted rows, perfect for his big machinery, but disastrous for holding soil and water. The fine topsoil, baked by the sun and unprotected, began to blow. On windy afternoons, a brown haze would rise from Dale's fields, a silent, creeping hemorrhage of his greatest asset. One sweltering afternoon in July, Art was in his machine shed, changing the oil on the 4640, when he heard a sound he'd never heard before. It was a high-pitched, metallic scream from the north, followed by a series of loud, concussive bangs, and then a sudden, profound silence. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked outside. A plume of black smoke was rising from the middle of Dale's largest field. Art got in his old Ford and drove over. He found Dale standing beside his giant Steiger Panther, its long green hood canted open. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt oil and hot metal. A connecting rod had let go. It had punched a dinner plate-sized hole in the side of the engine block before the other moving parts tore the engine's internals to shreds. A glistening pool of black oil was spreading slowly in the dusty soil. The massive tractor was dead. "She just let go," Dale said, his voice a hollow whisper. He was covered in sweat and dirt, his face pale beneath the tan. No warning, just a bang. Art looked at the engine. It was caked in a thick layer of oily dust. The radiator fins were choked with chaff. The machine had been run hard and put away wet, day after day. It had been begging for mercy. "When's the last time you changed the oil, Dale?" Art asked quietly. Dale flinched as if he'd been struck. "I don't know. Last winter, I guess. I've been busy. You know how it is. Frank's mechanic was supposed to come out. His voice trailed off. He kicked at one of the huge tires, a gesture of pure, helpless rage. "A new engine for this thing is $30,000. $30,000. Frank Blevins was not in a generous mood. His dealership lot was starting to fill up with new equipment nobody was buying. His own interest payments on his inventory were climbing every month. When Dale went to him, hat in hand, asking for a loan to cover the engine, Frank turned him down flat. "I can't, Dale," Frank had said, his face grim. "The bank won't let me extend any more credit. Not with these commodity prices. You'll have to get a second mortgage on some land." The cracks were no longer just appearing. They were splitting wide open. Dale had to take out a high-interest loan against his home 80, the original piece of ground his grandfather had homesteaded. The new engine arrived, and Dale was back in the field, but the desperation was etched on his face. He worked later, drove faster, pushed everything harder, as if he could outrun the interest compounding against him in a bank ledger 100 miles away. The coffee shop talk changed. The laughter and backslapping that had always surrounded Dale Peterson were replaced by hushed conversations and worried looks. They weren't laughing at Art Miller anymore. They were watching him. They saw him head to the field in the morning, in his clean, perfectly maintained tractor. They saw him quit at a reasonable hour in the evening. They saw a calm that they had mistaken for a lack of ambition. Now, it looked like something else, entirely. It looked like wisdom. The fall of 1981 was the breaking point. The Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, had pushed the prime interest rate to over 20%. Operating loans that had been written at 8% a year before were now renewing at 18, 20, 21%. It was a death sentence for anyone carrying heavy debt. Land values, which had been the foundation of the entire pyramid of credit, collapsed. Land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre 2 years ago was now struggling to bring $1,000 at auction. Suddenly, farmers across the county were receiving letters from their bankers. The letters were cold, filled with legal language, but their message was simple. Your collateral is no longer sufficient for your loan. You are in default. We are calling the note. The local paper, once filled with ads for new equipment and stories of record yields, now had a new section on the back page. Notices of foreclosure. Every week the list grew longer. The names were familiar. They were neighbors, friends, men who had been hailed as progressive farmers just a few years earlier. A quiet, suffocating panic settled over the countryside. It was a plague, silent and invisible, that devoured lifetimes of work and hope. Frank Blevins' dealership looked like a graveyard. The shiny new machines on the front line were gone, replaced by a motley collection of repossessed equipment. A 2-year-old International 1486, its paint faded and tires worn, sat with a summons taped to the cab window. A Kinsey planter, its boxes still half full of last year's seed, was parked next to it. These were not trade-ins. They were casualties. Frank himself looked like a ghost, his face gaunt, the swagger gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his empire crumble. Dale Peterson held on longer than most, fueled by sheer grit and denial. He sold off his breeding cows, then his feeder pigs. He worked a night shift at the factory in town, farming during the day, running on coffee and adrenaline. But it was like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon while the drain was wide open. The interest on his loans was compounding faster than he could ever hope to earn. The end came on a cold Tuesday in March. The county sheriff's car pulled into his lane. The deputy, a young man who had been in Dale's daughter's class in high school, looked sick as he handed Dale the papers. It was the official notice. The bank was foreclosing on all 1,500 acres, the house, the barns, everything. The auction was scheduled for the 1st of May. Art saw the auction notice in the paper. His heart ached. There was no satisfaction, no sense of vindication. There was only a profound sadness. He saw the story of his own father's generation playing out again, the same brutal cycle of boom and bust, of hope and despair. He thought of Dale, a good man and a hard worker who had simply believed the experts, who had played the game by the rules everyone had promoted. The game, it turned out, had been rigged. Art's farm was an island of tranquility. His Gleaner L2, now a decade old, but still running like a top, made short work of his harvest. His 4640 and Case 2470 performed flawlessly. His only costs were for the things he couldn't produce himself: fuel, seed, a few parts. He paid for them with a check, his account always in the black. He hadn't set foot in the bank to ask for a loan in 10 years. His bins were full, holding 3 years' worth of crops, waiting for the inevitable day the market would turn. He was a survivor, not because he was smarter, but because he had remembered a history everyone else had been so eager to forget. One afternoon, a few weeks before the auction, Art was greasing the front-end loader on his John Deere when he saw Frank Blevin's Lincoln pull into the lane. It was dusty, unwashed. Frank got out slowly, looking 10 years older than he had the last time Art saw him. "Art," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't offer to shake hands. I came to ask you something." "Go on, Frank," Art said, continuing to pump grease into a Zerk. "The bank is calling my notes, my floor plan loan. I've got to raise cash, fast. I was wondering, would you be interested in buying some of my parts inventory, or my shop tools? I'll sell them cheap." Art stopped his work and looked at the man who had once laughed at him. He saw no arrogance left, only desperation. "I've got all the tools I need, Frank," he said gently. "But I'll tell you what. I need a new set of tires for that old Ford of mine, and a couple of 500-gallon fuel barrels. Why don't you write me up an invoice for those, and make it for $5,000. Frank stared at him, confused. "Art, the tires and barrels are only worth maybe $1,200. "I know," Art said, pulling a clean rag from his pocket and wiping his hands. "But it looks to me like you could use a good customer right about now. Call it a down payment on future business." He walked into his shed, came back out with his checkbook, and wrote the check. He handed it to Frank. Frank Blevin's eyes welled up. He looked at the check, then at Art, his jaw working but no words coming out. He finally just nodded, a single, sharp nod of gratitude and defeat, got in his car, and drove away. The day of the Peterson auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that whipped across the farmyard, flapping the canvas on the auctioneer's truck. It felt more like a funeral than a sale. The entire community was there, their faces grim, their hands shoved deep in their pockets. They weren't there to bid. They were there to bear witness, to watch the final public act of a tragedy that was happening in private on farms all over the county. Dale Peterson was nowhere to be seen, but his wife and 2 teenage children stood by the porch of the farmhouse, their expressions numb with shock. The auctioneer started with the small items: tools, feed bunks, gates. The bidding was sparse, the prices heartbreakingly low. A lifetime of accumulation was being given away for pennies. Then came the machinery. The Steiger, with its new engine, sold for less than what Dale had paid for the engine alone. The planter, the chisel plough, the disc, all went for a fraction of their value to opportunistic buyers from out of state. Finally, it was time for the land. The auctioneer, a man who knew every family in the county, cleared his throat. His usual boisterous patter was gone, replaced by a somber, respectful tone. "All right, folks," he said. Now for the real estate. We'll be offering this in 3 parcels. First, the home 80. 80 acres, more or less, with the house, the barns, the outbuildings. A fine, fine piece of ground. The heart of this farm for 3 generations. He looked out at the crowd. What am I bid? Who'll start me at $1,000 an acre? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. 1,000, folks. 1,000 an acre for this beautiful farmstead. Do I hear 1,000? The bank representative, a young man in an ill-fitting suit, stood near the front, looking impatient. If no one bid, the bank would take possession of the land for the value of the remaining debt, a pittance. 800, then. Do I hear 800 an acre? The auctioneer pleaded. More silence. It was the silence of empty pockets and broken spirits. Then, from the back of the crowd, a calm, steady voice cut through the wind. $1,000. Every head turned. Arthur Miller stepped forward, his old seed corn cap pulled low. He looked at the auctioneer, his gaze unwavering. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The auctioneer's face broke into a relieved smile. I have 1,000. Thank you, Mr. Miller. $1,000 an acre. Do I hear 1,100? The banker stepped forward to confer with the auctioneer, then nodded. The bank was willing to let it go at that price to avoid the hassle of owning it. $1,000 once, the auctioneer called. $1,000 twice. He looked around the crowd one last time. Sold for $1,000 an acre to Arthur Miller. He sold off the other, larger parcels of bare land to a corporate farming entity from Des Moines for a similarly low price. But Art had what he came for. He had saved the heart of the farm. After the crowd dispersed and the auction trucks rumbled away, Art walked over to the farmhouse. Dale's wife looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm looking for Dale," Art said gently. She pointed toward the machine shed. Art found him inside, sitting on an overturned bucket in the dim light, staring at the empty space where his Steiger used to be. He didn't look up when Art entered. "I suppose you're here to tell me to get off your land," Dale said, his voice flat and dead. "No," Art said. He pulled up another bucket and sat down, the silence stretching between them. "I remember when my dad lost a quarter section back in the 30s, Art said finally. "The bank took it. A man from Chicago bought it, sight unseen. Never set foot on it. My dad had to watch a stranger farm the land his own father had cleared. It nearly broke him." He looked at Dale. "That's not going to happen to you." Dale looked up, his eyes hollow. "What are you talking about? You bought it. It's yours." "That's right," Art said, "and I'm renting it back to you. The house, the barns, this shed. You and your family can stay right here." Dale stared at him. "I can't afford to pay you rent, Art. I don't have a penny to my name." "The rent is $1, Art said, "for the whole year. And I'm writing up a contract. It'll give you the option to buy this 80 acres back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. No interest. You just pay me when you can. Take 10 years. Take 20. I don't care." Dale was speechless. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And one more thing," Art added. "Planting season is coming up. I'm getting too old to be climbing in and out of that tractor cab all day. I could use a good man to help me. I'll pay you a fair wage." Tears streamed down Dale Peterson's face, cutting clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't just being offered a lifeline. He was being offered his dignity. He nodded, unable to speak, and for the first time in over a year, a flicker of something other than despair appeared in his eyes. The years that followed were lean, But they were healing. The farm economy slowly found its footing. Dale worked alongside Art, and the two men, once symbols of opposing philosophies, became friends. Dale learned the quiet rhythms of Art's farm, the value of maintenance, the peace of being debt-free. He saved every dollar he could. 7 years after the auction, he walked into Art's kitchen and placed a cashier's check on the table, buying back his family's home. By the early 1990s, Art was in his late 70s. He still worked, but his pace had slowed. His grandson, a bright young man named Michael, spent his summers on the farm. Art taught him everything. He taught him how to read the land, how to listen to an engine, how to tell when a crop was ready. But the most important lessons happened in the machine shed. One sunny afternoon, Art stood beside the John Deere 4640 as Michael, now 16, pumped grease into the axle pivots. The tractor, nearly 20 years old, still gleamed. Its engine started with a single turn of the key and settled into a smooth, powerful idle. "You see this tractor, Michael?" Art said, running his hand over the green fender. "It's never had a banker's hand on it. It belongs to us. That's the most important thing. It's not about how much you farm. It's about how much of it you truly own." Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had heard the stories. He had seen the abandoned farmhouses scattered across the county, monuments to the bust. Art Miller lived to see the new century. He passed away peacefully in his own bed, in the same house where he was born. He left the farm, the machinery, and a legacy of quiet wisdom to his grandson. Sometimes, on a calm summer evening, Michael will shut down the tractor in the field and just sit for a moment, listening. He can hear the distant hum of other machines on other farms, bigger and more powerful than his own. He can hear the sound of progress. But in the quiet of his own cab, in the solid, paid-for machine his grandfather bought so many years ago, he hears something else. He hears the sound of freedom. He looks out over the healthy crops, over the land that is truly his, and he understands. The old man wasn't just buying tractors that day. He was buying a future.